today. It is 3 p.m., so we are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Rachel Hildebrandt. I am the Senior Director of the National Fund at Partners for Sacred Places, and this is our agenda for today. First, I'm going to provide a high-level overview of the National Fund. Then I'm going to walk you through the components of the program. Then we're going to talk about the application process. And at the end, there's going to be 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. Before we get started, though, I want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. First, this presentation is being recorded, and afterwards, it's going to be posted to our website. Expect to see it there within about a week. And our website is fundforsacredplaces.org. Second, if you have a question for our team, please use the Q&A feature to submit your question. The chat is disabled. That being said, please hold your questions until the end. There's a possibility that we will answer your question during the program, and we want to get through it all before we start fielding questions. Last, because we're not going to be able to answer everyone's questions today during our limited time together, we're going to select the questions that are most widely applicable to everybody to answer. If you have a question about your specific circumstances, eligibility, or project that doesn't get answered by the end of the session, please feel free to reach out to us directly. We're always happy to get back to you, and our contact information will be shared at the end. All right, National Fund overview. Historic houses of worship across America contribute significant value to their communities. Sacred places function as hubs for social service programs, provide space for community gathering and organizing, and host a variety of arts programming. The National Fund exists to support these congregations and their buildings, and ultimately to advance the common good. The National Fund launched in 2016 with a 7-figure grant from the Indiana-based Lilly Endowment, Inc. Last year, we're so grateful to them, they renewed their support with an additional $20 million grant, which will enable us to offer this program through 2028 and double the number of congregations that we serve. In fact, this year, we're going to fund about 40 congregations. Since its inception, the National Fund has awarded or pledged approximately $26 million to 138 congregations representing 26 faith traditions, 42 states. The National Fund is a program of Partners for Sacred Places in collaboration with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Our organizations work closely together to administer the program. A word about Partners, which is where I am. Partners for Sacred Places is the only non-sectarian nonprofit dedicated to the sound stewardship and active community use of older sacred places. For over 30 years, we've empowered congregations to care for their buildings and share them with their communities. We do that through a combination of grant-funded programming such as the National Fund and for-fee consulting. Jennifer, would you like to introduce yourself and the trust?
Yes, thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. I'm Jennifer Sandy, a Senior Director of Preservation Programs at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which Rachel mentioned is the partner organization with Partners for Sacred Places on the National Fund. The National Trust for Historic Preservation is a privately funded nonprofit organization dedicated to helping communities maintain and enhance the power of historic places. This year, the National Trust is celebrating our 75th anniversary. We're proud to collaborate with Partners for Sacred Places on the National Fund for Sacred Places program. Back to you, Rachel.
Thank you. The National Fund team consists of staff members from both Partners and the National Trust, including dedicated full-time staff on both sides. Today, you're going to hear from me, of course, as well as Lily Hamilton, Associate Director at Partners for Sacred Places, Jennifer Sandy, Senior Director of Preservation Programs at the National Trust, and Ann Phillips, Senior Preservation Architect for the Fund at the National Trust. It's also important to mention that we are supported by an awesome advisory committee, which is comprised of talented individuals from a diversity of backgrounds and fields. Each year, the committee meets in September to help us staff determine which congregations to fund. Here is the list continued. All right, it's time to talk about the program components. The National Fund is a program, not just a grant. That language is very intentional. That's because in addition to the capital grant, our participants receive training, technical assistance, and a planning grant of up to $20,000. Ultimately, these offerings are provided to grantees because we want grantees to be successful in completing the project we're funding. And we also want them to leave our program with new and expanded capacity to take on future capital work. All right, here is a timeline, a typical timeline. And these dates are tailored to the congregations, you all who will be applying this year. I'm going to spend a good amount of time on this slide because there's a lot here to sort out. You'll hear me say this again and again. The National Fund is not a typical grant program. And in terms of the timeline, it's not typical because it's not that you get the funds as soon as you're selected. You have to wait a while to get the funds because there are certain benchmarks that you have to reach. In order to access our capital grant, you've got to meet key architectural planning and fundraising benchmarks. Those benchmarks include you've got to raise 1/4 of the match. There is a match required, and you've got to produce, for our review, construction-ready drawings and specifications for the National Fund scope of work. The National Fund scope of work is the project that we're funding. Please keep this in mind as I walk you through the timeline. This year, we're going to notify applicants in early October. Then we're going to publish a press release announcing the new cohort in mid-October. That's going to give the new grantees a couple of weeks to plan for comms, communications. Then training is the next step. Training, which is mandatory for new grantees, will take place in mid-November. After the training, we'll begin quarterly check-ins. Each congregation is assigned a National Fund staff person, and that staff person will initiate and lead check-ins via Zoom every 3 months or so for the 2 years the congregation, the grantee, is working through the program. Most congregations will spend about 1 year working toward the architectural planning and fundraising benchmarks that I described just a moment ago. During that year, that first year, we provide a planning grant and technical assistance. Why a year, you may be wondering. I know that sounds like a really long time to wait. So in addition to waiting for notification in October, you then have another year. The reason is that's when the architectural planning and fundraising, all aimed at meeting those 2 benchmarks, takes place. Once you've met the benchmarks, however, you complete what we call the capital grant submission. We review capital grant submissions carefully to ensure that the work we're funding meets high preservation standards. More on that later. Our review process typically takes 30 to 45 days, and construction on the projects we're funding cannot begin until we've reviewed and approved the capital grant submissions. So that's all very important information to take in terms of the timeline and planning ahead. Once we have approved the capital grant submission, though, construction can begin. At that point, we disperse the first half of the grant. We disperse the second half once construction has wrapped. Our soft target for construction is 1 year, but we're flexible. So in total, it is a 2-year process or so. Now that we've discussed the timeline and where the various components of the program fit in, I'm going to walk you all through the program components individually. Training. Grantees are required to send a team of 2 to 3 leaders, including clergy, to an intensive 2-day training. We typically recommend that congregations send the individuals who are going to most closely be involved with architectural planning and fundraising to the training because it is really most relevant to them. We cover topics such as capital project planning, making your case for support, community-wide fundraising, friends groups, and supporting organizations. And we also do a version of this again because we want to refresh everyone's memory on how this program works. Each cohort includes congregations from different faith traditions, geographies, and backgrounds, and also congregations that have varying levels of experience with capital project planning and fundraising. So the training is a really great opportunity for congregations to learn from us, but also each other. Training is mandatory. Takes place in November in Philadelphia because Partners for Sacred Places is headquartered here in Philadelphia, where I am today. And we cover most of the cost of participating, meaning we organize lodging for everybody that RSVPs, and then we reimburse for travel and meals up to $1,500 per congregation. Technical assistance. Each of our grantees is eligible to receive a technical assistance package that's tailored to its needs. The technical assistance offerings, which are bulleted out here, are intended to help our participants advance their National Fund projects. I'm not going to explain each of these in detail, but more information is available on the National Fund website if you want to dive in on this. The key things to know that I want you to take away from today are that, one, each congregation is asked to choose one of these services. Two, the services are delivered by experienced Partners for Sacred Places staff. Three, it's completely pro bono. And four, grantees have 15 months to take advantage of these offerings. Planning grant. So the planning grants are intended to help offset the costs of project planning. They are typically used to fund things like conditions assessments or architectural design services, capital campaign consulting services, or the creation of marketing materials, including video. There is no match required. So if we give a congregation that has been accepted into the fund a planning grant of $20,000, there's no additional matching necessary for that. One thing that I do want to note here before I move on to the next slide is we accept congregations into the program at various stages of architectural planning, and there will be lots more on that later. But if your congregation does not have a conditions assessment yet, we will likely recommend that you, if you are accepted into the program, use the planning grant to secure a conditions assessment. I know that the creation of marketing materials and working with a capital campaign consultant is really appealing, but we really believe strongly in a strong foundation for the work ahead. Capital grant. Our grants range from $50,000 to $500,000, and all grants require a one-to-one match. So for example, a congregation receiving a grant of $250,000 has got to raise a $250,000 match. The congregation receives $400,000, they've got to raise a $400,000 match. And matching funds must be new money raised after program entry. So all of the following can count toward your match: congregational giving, cash or documented pledges from individuals, foundations, or corporations, proceeds from fundraising events, government grants, proceeds from the sale of stock or real estate, matured bequests, and then in-kind donations to the project, such as donated materials or professional services. For that last item, donated materials or professional services, we cap that at 20%. So if you receive that toward your match, that cannot exceed 20% of the total match required. The following items are ineligible: endowment or reserve funds, including interest, bridge or construction loans, funds solicited, applied for, pledged, or secured prior to official acceptance into the program, and other grants from the National Trust for Historic Preservation or partners. And I just want to note, so we get this question a lot, you can raise funds before entry into the program. So if you've begun fundraising already or really need to do so in the next year, that's okay. However, those funds that you raise cannot be counted toward the match. All right, so what do we fund? What kinds of projects do we fund? Our projects fall into three categories. We fund projects that address urgent repair needs, projects that improve functionality or improve accessibility of the property in accordance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and projects that make vacant or underutilized space usable for community outreach. However, please note, it is so important that applicants demonstrate that urgent repair needs to the building or envelope have already been identified and addressed before proposing ADA or interior rehabilitation projects. This is a partial list of what we don't pay for. Please visit fundforsacredplaces.org, our website, for a complete list of what is ineligible. But I will call out a couple of things that I see in applications pretty frequently. Things like landscaping or fencing, parking lots, religious art restoration, such as mural restoration, pipe organ restoration or replacement, pew restoration or replacement, AV equipment, and security upgrades. Those are all items that are ineligible for the National Fund. Capital grant submission. You're going to hear this used again and again, capital grant submission. It's the key thing that congregations, once they're admitted into the program, are working toward. I said this, but I'll emphasize the National Fund is a little different from other grant programs because the capital grant is not dispersed at the outset. Each participating congregation has to reach these key benchmarks related to architectural planning and fundraising. The benchmarks, again, are 1/4 of the match raised. The match can be either in hand or pledged at the capital grant submission stage. And you've got to produce construction-ready drawings and specifications for the National Fund scope of work. We do also ask to see the bid or bids you've selected for your project. Now, please note, we do recommend that congregations secure 3 bids as part of a competitive bidding process. However, that is a recommendation, not a requirement. Also, if you secure multiple bids, we don't ask to see all of those bids. We ultimately just want to see the bid or bids that you selected for your project. Once our team has reviewed and approved the capital grant submission, remember it's 30 to 45 days for our review. Once we've signed off on it, the first half of the grant award will be dispersed and construction can begin. Then the other half of the award is dispersed once the National Fund scope of work, construction on that scope, has been completed. This is a one and done submission, so please keep in mind that if your project includes multiple components, you've got to have and submit to us those construction-ready drawings and specifications for each and every one of the projects that comprise the National Fund scope. We can't review documentation in a piecemeal way. It's really all submitted at one time, so that's important to take into consideration with planning. Reporting requirements. This is really just an FYI. Grantees are expected to submit an interim report once construction is roughly 50% complete, and a final report once construction is 100% complete. Once we review and approve the final report, we schedule a final site visit. It's not an inspection, it's really just an opportunity to reflect on the process of being part of the National Fund. We like to see the work that's been completed as well. We do try to do that in person when possible. If it's not possible to do it in person, we do it virtually, but it's always part of the wrap up for grants. Once we've completed the final site visit, we disperse the second half of the grant. All right, please note, this is so important. We don't fund work that we have not reviewed. Okay. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ann Phillips, Senior Preservation Architect at the National Trust, to discuss capital project planning.
All right, thanks, Rachel. Hi, everybody. I'm Ann Phillips. I'm the Senior Preservation Architect with the National Fund for Sacred Places. I am on the National Trust for Historic Preservation side of things. And today I'm going to talk to you about capital project planning. So as Rachel, going back to what she mentioned about eligible project scope and types of projects, just to reiterate, the project must have urgent repair needs related to structural components, walls, roof, and or other elements of the building envelope that are integral to building preservation and longevity. Projects that improve functionality or improve accessibility of the property in accordance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, are also eligible, as well as renovation projects that make vacant or underutilized space usable for community outreach, but applicants should demonstrate that urgent repair needs to the building envelope have already been identified through a building conditions assessment and that those issues have been addressed before proposing ADA or interior rehabilitation projects. So the big question here is, how do you determine if your building has urgent repair needs? A building conditions assessment is how you do that. So what is it? It is a report that is commissioned from an architect, engineer, or other professional specialist that assesses the building's condition holistically, identifies interconnected issues, presents a list of prioritized recommendations. So what is most urgent and what is the order of magnitude? In what order should they be addressed? And this is part of the pre-design phase of a capital project. So this document is truly the starting point to determining the scope of work that you will undertake. What is its purpose? Why do we need it? Not only is it critical as a sort of checkup for historic buildings, as the owner of a historic building, it actually benefits you to have an up-to-date conditions assessment. Up to date, what does that mean? Every 5 years or so. For us, we typically will want you to have a conditions assessment that is no older than 5 years if you've already done one prior to coming into the program. That conditions assessment helps you make informed decisions about the urgent and necessary building repairs and can keep your building maintained in a proactive way rather than a reactive one. So, for example, a conditions assessment may show the beginnings of water infiltration at the roof before it becomes a bigger issue and a much larger project. So what another purpose is, it assesses the building holistically. So it looks at the building as a whole made of many parts, right? So there are many systems working together in a building. It also diagnoses the origins of any pre-existing issues. So I show this image of the X-ray of the building because it's similar to an X-ray or an MRI in that it helps to diagnose interconnected issues that may not be obvious. So, for example, a leak in the sanctuary, you could assume it's from the roof, but it very well could be a leaking condensing unit on the roof rather than a hole in the roof, for example. So if you didn't understand where that leak was coming from or why it was leaking, you may just replace the roof and hope for the best, but your condensing unit is still up there and is still leaking. And so you haven't actually addressed the real issue there. It also helps you explore repair and renovation options before you enter the design phase. So it's an opportunity to understand the urgent needs of the building and the priorities of the building before heading into the design and construction phases. Taking a step back, it helps you review multiple options, outcomes, pros and cons to help you determine the best path forward. This helps avoid investing unnecessary time and resources into your capital project. So the question to you all is, do you have an up-to-date building conditions assessment for your building? If not, we highly recommend you have one completed. As an owner of a historic structure, it is best practice to have an updated document such as this to help guide your maintenance, repair, and rehabilitation discussions so that your building can be best cared for and carry your congregation into the next century. While it's not required to have a conditions assessment before applying to the National Fund for Sacred Places, your application may be more competitive if you have an updated conditions assessment that you can discuss and mention in your application. Next slide, please. Okay, so the last slide was what a conditions assessment is and why it's important, but this one is about how you actually make it happen, how you have it delivered to you, essentially. So first and foremost, always seek out experienced professionals. So consider professionals experienced with historic properties, look at their websites, their portfolios, check their references, check references of contractors and architects, talk to their past clients, do your homework and really understand who the professionals are that you plan to work with and identify who might be the best fit. So how do you find the experienced professionals you need to do this type of assessment? Our suggestion is always to reach out to your local preservation organizations. That could be a historical society, it could be a municipal historic preservation office at your housed at your city. Those are often housed within the planning departments, not always, but and then always go to your state historic preservation office or SHPO. Each state has a historic preservation office, and any of those resources will have suggestions of experienced professionals who would be able to help you accomplish this work. And so what is the deliverable, or what should you expect out of this sort of assessment? The format of the final product may vary, so there's not a hard and fast rule about what this looks like, but it typically includes photographs of the detailed photographs of the existing conditions, a thorough report of some sort describing the existing conditions, and a prioritized list of recommended actions, which should be used to inform your project's scope of work. Next slide. And this next slide is just a visual representation of the different types of documentation that can come from a conditions assessment. So on the left side, you'll see this is sort of an 8.5 by 11 standard report where it has the detailed photographs with text about the condition and about recommended actions. Then on the right, you see an actual elevation drawing with photographs, detailed photographs keyed into the elevation, so you can see exactly where those conditions are located. Sometimes you'll have just an 8.5 by 11 report. Other times you may have a 24 by 36 large format set of drawings, similar to the image on the right. Sometimes both of these things will be part of the conditions assessment. Each architect does things slightly differently. So just so you're aware of this sort of visual, what it should look like, the building conditions assessment. Next slide. Oh, just one more note. What it is not, this is often a question we get, is it's not a building inspection. So it's different than a building inspection. Okay, so now we'll jump into sort of how is a capital project completed. We talked about the building conditions assessment, which is really what helps you define your project. But where does that conditions assessment fit into the larger capital project planning process? It should be the absolute first thing that you do. So the traditional project delivery method for capital projects is called the design, bid, build method. The design phase, as you see here, sort of illuminated or highlighted, contains steps number 1 and 2. So during step number 1, pre-design and diagnostics, you, along with qualified professionals experienced in historic properties, should be assessing the building holistically and diagnosing origins of pre-existing issues before the design phase. This is when you will have your building conditions assessment completed. The results of that assessment are what will determine the scope of your project and help you move into phase 2. Phase 2, step 2. Step 2, architectural design, is when you will work with a qualified architect who has experience in historic buildings to determine the best path forward for your project. Taking the priorities identified in the building conditions assessment, the architect will work with you to determine the best solution and craft or design an architectural solution. This is where the Secretary of the Interior standards come in. Next slide. So the National Fund for Sacred Places requires that projects adhere to the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. The Secretary of the Interior standards are a ubiquitous, typical approach or framework that is used in the historic preservation field, including use by federal, state, and local governments. The purpose of the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties is to, number 1, provide guidance to historic building owners and building managers, preservation consultants, architects, contractors, and project reviewers prior to beginning work. And also, it is always recommended that preservation professionals be consulted early in any project. It is critical that you work with a qualified architect who not only has experience with historic properties, but also is familiar with and understands how to apply the standards to your project. There are 4 treatments for historic properties outlined by the National Park Service: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. We require adherence to the standards for rehabilitation as they are the most flexible. Once you and your architect are in the architectural design phase, it is imperative that you use the standards to help develop the architectural solution. The standards should be consulted from the very beginning of the design process. So as you see here on this slide, there are 10 standards. We don't necessarily need to read them for the purposes of this presentation, but I just wanted you to see that there are 10 of them. I also included the website at the bottom, should you want to visit that. Next slide, please. Okay, so once you've assessed your building holistically and have diagnosed the origins of any pre-existing issues through a building conditions assessment, you have worked with your architect using the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation as a guide to develop your project scope, and they've documented it through a set of construction or bid documents or drawings. It's time to put the project out to bid. So we'll pick up here on step number 3 with the bid. So at the bidding phase, you gather pricing, determine and hire a contractor who will complete the construction of the project based on the documentation generated in the design phase by the architect. You go to the next slide, please. What's important here is for the National Fund for Sacred Places program, the first major milestone, which is when the first half of your grant award is dispersed. It's what we call the capital grant submission, as Rachel mentioned earlier. This submission happens after you have received bids for your capital project and have selected your contractor, but before you start construction. Our review and approval of this submission is what prompts the disbursement of the first half of your grant award and essentially authorizes you to start construction. To reiterate Rachel's previous slide, construction cannot begin before we approve the work. Once construction, go back one slide, there you go. Once construction is underway, that's when the contractor makes the actual physical changes to the building based on the construction documents produced by the architect. And then step number 5, post-construction, is wrapping up all the details, closing the project out. That's when you'll get certificates of substantial completion, certificate of final completion, certificate of occupancy. The contractor will provide all manuals and warranties and as-built drawings if that is included in your contract. And then your project is wrapped up. So that's a little bit about capital project planning and how it relates to the National Fund for Sacred Places at this time. And I guess that does wrap up the program components portion of the presentation as well. So I'll hand it back to Rachel to talk about the application process.
Thank you. So I'm gonna start by presenting this timeline for 2025. If you have applied to the program previously, I want you to know that we are doing things differently this year. We are no longer asking congregations to submit an LOI. We're moving to an application followed by an additional information form. So to summarize, the application is a comprehensive application that captures information related to our 6 core criteria, which are historic, cultural, or architectural significance, community serving congregations, project scope and need, fundraising readiness, healthy congregations, and strong applications. The application is completed online via online grants system Foundant. So this year, we're going to ask a limited number of congregations, once we have reviewed all of the applications, to complete the second step in the process, which is the additional information form. This form is designed to capture additional detailed information about the applicant's architectural planning and any other information we need for funding decisions. At this second and final stage in the application process, which will be much, much, much less onerous than what we call the full application in the past, Congregations may be asked to work with National Fund staff to refine their proposed project scope in accordance with grant guidelines. So if you are advanced to the additional information form phase, you work closely with staff to kind of strengthen your application and refine your project scope. So dates are up there. You're going to hear back on the application by June 19th. You'll know whether you've been invited to the next stage. And then ultimately, we're going to send out notifications in October. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Associate Director Lily Hamilton to talk about eligibility and criteria in the application process.
Awesome. Thanks, Rachel. So a little bit about our basic eligibility criteria. In order to qualify for the National Fund, your property has to meet all of these items for basic eligibility. Your property has to have been originally built as a house of worship. It must be owned and occupied by an active congregation or held in trust by its denominational body. The applicant must be either the congregation itself or a closely affiliated nonprofit. And by that, we mean a friends group or a nonprofit organization that resides within the house of worship. And if the applicant is a congregation, it must be at least 3 years old. So we screen for these basic criteria first, and we will not review any applications from congregations who don't meet all of them. Next slide. So after we review the eligibility criteria, we take a look at the 6 evaluation criteria that Rachel mentioned. These are then listed here. Our team assesses applications based on these, and congregations must be strong in all of these areas in order to be competitive. So let's go through them. Next slide. First is historic, cultural, or architectural significance. Successful applicants are able to demonstrate their place in history by answering questions such as, how does your congregation relate to themes in American history and American religious history? Does the building tell a story of importance to marginalized or underrepresented groups? If your building was designed by a notable architect, how does it rank in the body of that architect's work? Is the building an exceptional example of its style? So your building does not have to be on the national, state, or local register to qualify for the National Fund. However, if your building is on one of these registers, or if it's been deemed eligible for one, that's usually a good indicator that you're going to be able to check this box. A common question that we get is, our church is historic, but we need to invest in our parish house next door. Will you fund our project if it's not focused on the historic sanctuary building? And the answer is yes. We sometimes fund auxiliary buildings, such as the parish house or an education building. And we make that determination on a case-by-case basis. Ultimately, it should contribute to the overall significance of the sacred place. It's also more common with projects that are focusing on rehabilitating underused space for community serving programs, for example. Next slide. Community serving congregations. We know that houses of worship serve many people beyond their congregations and often serve as gathering places or de facto community centers. So we're looking for congregations that operate and host programming, serving vulnerable and at-risk populations, share space with non-affiliated groups and organizations, often at subsidized rates, partner with other congregations, faith-based groups, nonprofits, or municipalities, and that have a widespread reputation for being a welcoming center of community life. So if you regularly serve meals to people experiencing homelessness, host musical performances in your sanctuary, or share space with local organizations, make sure to highlight those activities. We want to see that your sacred place is being used outside of your regular worship hours. Next slide. Project scope and need. Anne and Rachel spoke on much of this earlier in the presentation, but I'm just going to reiterate some of the key points. We fund projects that address urgent repair needs, improve functionality or improve accessibility, make vacant or underused space usable for community outreach. And it's important to note that applicants should demonstrate that urgent repair needs to the building envelope have already been identified by a building conditions assessment and addressed before proposing ADA or interior rehabilitation projects. So if you come with an ADA project or interior rehab project of any kind, but have an actively leaking roof, it will raise some questions for our evaluators, just something to keep in mind. All projects have to adhere to the Secretary of the Interior standards. And the National Fund scope of work is not finalized until that capital grant submission occurs and that it's been reviewed and approved by our program staff. So sometimes we fund what's proposed in the application, and other times we fund projects that have been identified as more urgent after we've been in further conversation with a grantee congregation. Next slide. All right, fundraising readiness. We're looking for congregations that have begun to lay the groundwork for a capital campaign or major fundraising effort. This is a matching grant. We're looking for congregations that have established a realistic fundraising goal. So this is important to keep in mind. Think of your congregation's capacity and past history of fundraising success when you're figuring out what amount to ask from the National Fund. And also keep in mind the project scope that you have in mind for the National Fund to cover. You know, we want you to ask for what you need in order to accomplish that proposed scope of work, but try not to ask for an amount that is outside of your ability to fundraise. If you've never done a really large capital campaign before, or if you've only ever raised $100,000, it may not be realistic to request $500,000 from us right off the bat. And if you haven't yet started the process of planning for your fundraising campaign, now might be a really good time to start. Do you have a committee in place? Have you considered working with a fundraising consultant? Taking these steps will help us assess your readiness. Ultimately, you have to be willing and able to raise matching funds within the 2-year program period, and finally demonstrate a need for project funds that exceed the congregation's typical donor base. Next slide. The National Fund prioritizes healthy and stable congregations so that our investment is truly impactful and lasting. So we look for the following, though this is not an exhaustive list: tenured, well-respected clergy, capable lay leadership, stable or growing membership, financial strength and stability, positive and supportive relationships with your regional denominational offices, if that's applicable to your faith tradition, and a history of weathering challenges with resilience. We take a lot of these into, we consider the general context of your congregation, like when we are evaluating healthy congregations. It's not a checklist. It's okay if one or more of these items don't apply to you. For example, if you're a newer clergy person at a congregation, that's not an immediate red flag for us at all. We understand that turnover like that happens. So keep that in mind when you're assessing yourselves in this list. All right, next slide. This is our last evaluation criteria: strong applications. It's a very competitive program, so we urge applicants to really put their best feet forward. Applications should be completed in full with all the required attachments. Make a compelling case for support. Clearly articulate the project's goals and components, and include high quality, high resolution photographs that help us to fully appreciate your building. It's super important to tell your story as best as you can and really connect with what makes your congregation special and stands out. Be careful about spelling. Make sure to take advantage of the full character count for each question, and the more information you can provide, the better. And next slide. So I'm going to talk a bit about how to access the application in Foundant and what you'll see once you begin the applications. So in order to find the application, you go to our website, fundforsacredplaces.org, and hit the Apply Now button. Next slide. That'll take you to the login page where if you've applied previously to the National Fund, you can use your existing credentials to log in and start a new application. And if this is your first time applying to the National Fund, you'll need to create a new account and make a profile for your faith community for yourself. Next slide. Once you're on your home page, after creating your account or logging in, you will see the National Fund for Sacred Places 2025 and the Apply button. Once you click that, it'll take you to the application where you can see all of the questions that we're asking for this cycle. Next slide. And up at the top of the screen, when you are on the application, you'll see a button that says Collaborate. If you'd like to add collaborators, other folks who are on the fundraising committee at your congregation, for example, you can enter in their email information and they'll get an access link that they can then use to fill in the questions directly in Foundant. Next slide. And if you'd like to circulate the application questions, perhaps to a larger group of people, you don't want everybody to have access to Foundant to edit the application directly, you can click this question list button and it'll download a PDF of all of the application questions that you could then email around to your team, even turn into a Word document to make edits to it directly. Just make sure that you are then inputting all of your answers into Foundant after you've done so. Next slide. As you're going through the application and filling in your questions, you should make sure to save the application periodically to make sure you're not losing any important information or progress. And once you've completed all of the questions, uploaded all of your pictures, and attached any of the required attachments that we request, you can hit the Submit Application button at the bottom. It's very important to hit this button. We are unable to review any applications that are not submitted. We won't receive it. So make sure you're doing this. And once you submit it, you will receive a confirmation email from Foundant. So if you don't get that confirmation email, make sure you check your spam folder. And if you still can't find it, you should reach out to us. We can help troubleshoot with you. All right. And with that, I will pass it over to Jennifer Sandy for the Q&A.
All right, thanks, Lily. Well, just at the outset, this was a question that came in that we did answer live in the Q&A, but I wanted to just share with the whole group so you can respond, Rachel. Questions about, is this program federally funded or impacted by recent funding freezes at the federal level?
Fair question. The answer to that is no. We are privately funded, so all the things that are going on right now don't impact this particular program.
Okay, questions about how many applications we anticipate receiving and how many we anticipate funding this year.
Yeah, sure. So I will answer that question by giving you the numbers from last year and saying that I think we're going to get more applications this year than we did last year, because that has certainly been the trend. Last year, we got about 500 applications. We then invited 38 congregations to the second stage of the application process and funded 24. However, like I said earlier, we received a gift that will enable us to support double the number of congregations moving forward through 2028. And we anticipate funding 40 plus congregations this year, and every year we're funded moving forward.
Okay. So we're getting a lot of questions about the matching fund requirement. What happens if the full matching funds are not raised from the congregation or community within the project time?
Good question. We do expect 100% of the match to be raised and in hand by the time construction wraps up. What we want to avoid is that type of situation that you just described, Jennifer. We really do want congregations to raise that money by the time construction is wrapped up and within the 2-year grant period. So if you're feeling like your congregation may not be able to do that, perhaps kind of go back to the drawing board on what you're going to ask us for in terms of the grant award. Like, make sure that what you're asking us for corresponds to a match that you feel confident you can raise in the period, in the 2-year period, because success is really critical.
Yeah. We also had a question about do we ever award less than what is requested in the application in terms of the grant amount?
Yeah. In years prior, we would occasionally do that, but that was sort of a different ball game. So the short answer is no. So make sure you tailor your request really carefully, both to your capacity and the size of your project.
Yeah. So just to reiterate, we're going to aim to fully fund requests.
Yes.
much as possible. There are some questions around what if congregations have pre-existing capital campaigns or ongoing, and how does that work in terms of the not being able to raise matching funds prior to program entry? And can you talk a little bit about maybe how you could phase a larger project in order to meet our requirements?
Yeah, sure. So there are lots of congregations that ask us to fund a later phase of an ongoing project where fundraising has already started. There's one that comes to mind immediately that is asking us to fund phase 2 of a large masonry project, and their capital campaign started, it's well underway, and everything raised is going to be used to fund phase 1. Then they'll pivot and begin raising matching funds for phase 2, which we are funding. So phasing is a good option. And also, keep in mind that you can do that. You can raise funds now and until October. It's just that they can't count toward the match.
Yeah. We had a question about essentially why we're requiring new funds for matching. So perhaps someone has some insurance proceeds they already have and they want to use that for part of a project. Can you talk a little bit about the intent behind that?
Absolutely. Yeah. We require that matching funds be new money because we want our grant to be catalytic. We want congregations to come into our program well positioned to take advantage of the training, the planning grant, and technical assistance, and leverage it to find new and creative sources of funding and support. So we are a little less interested in sort of closing the gap for projects. So if a project comes to us and they've raised 75%, want us to just kind of close it out, that's not really a good fit for us because ultimately we want to inspire the congregation to go further and farther, and for our grant to act as sort of like a challenge grant. That's the intent.
Yeah. Another question about match: can the sale of property be considered match?
Yes, if the property is donated to the congregation as match. So if you have property that you've been thinking about selling, we don't want to encourage you to sell it by, calling that eligible. So that's not eligible if you have property already and you want to sell it. But if someone donates property to the congregation as match, the proceeds from the sale of the property can be counted toward the match.
Okay. So moving on to some questions about architectural planning. We have a question about if we have a recent conditions assessment and we already have architectural drawings, are we still eligible to apply?
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
And that
If you
that
don't, you
would be a
also
bonus.
are.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a bonus. You're eligible if yes, you're eligible if no. We accept congregations into the program at various stages of planning. It's just really key that everyone understand the best practices and, come alongside us and employing those best practices for the National Fund project.
Yeah. A question about, because the grant process takes so long and, perhaps already having leaks in the roof or something, is it okay to use temporary patches to prevent further damage?
Oh my gosh, yes.
That is yes, please do that.
Yes, please. We don't want our process or timeline to hinder addressing those types of issues. Absolutely move forward and address urgent repair needs because this is a really competitive program and it's not guaranteed that you'll get the grant even if you do apply. So, if you get it, that's awesome. Still don't wait to do that urgent work.
Yeah. Can you explain more about your definition of an affiliated nonprofit organization?
Yeah. So in this context, typically an affiliated nonprofit is a friends group of the congregation that exists to either help the congregation manage the building or raise funds for the building. Sometimes there's also a close collaborating nonprofit with a slightly different purpose, but that works closely with the congregation and where there is some overlap in leadership, that also counts. But, if you're feeling, whoever asked that question, like it's still unclear, that's the type of thing you can reach out to us to ask for clarity on your specific situation.
So we're getting a lot of comments and questions about the planning grants. And I think just clarification about, can people just apply for a planning grant? How does the planning grant work?
Sure. The planning grant is only available to National Fund grantees. So the planning grant, along with the technical assistance and training, are really only for the congregations that we admit into the program. Unfortunately, there isn't a separate planning grant at this time that is available quite yet.
And just a note that the National Trust for Historic Preservation does have small grants that can support planning. So I've been putting this in the Q&A quite a bit, but if folks want to go to the National Trust for Historic Preservation's website, which is savingplaces.org, and if you do /grants, you'll get to the page where we have grants, and they tend to be smaller, but we do have some grants that can support that type of planning work. And related to that, one question that has come up, which I know you addressed, Rachel, but we'll just reiterate, can churches apply for a grant from the National Trust if they are awarded? And they certainly can, but you can't use those funds to match National Fund grants. We're getting a lot of questions about what age does the building need to be in order to qualify. So can you talk a little bit about how we approach historic significance?
Yeah. Ooh, that's a tough one. That's a good question. There is no specific age. We really focus on older and historic properties, and we look to congregations that are applying to make the case for significance to us. So in the application, make sure to tell us why your building is significant. And we will evaluate case by case. Jennifer, if you have anything to add on that, feel free. But
no,
that's what I'm thinking.
And I think there were some questions around trying to get at, does it need to be really fancy or really architecturally decorative or significant in order to be considered? And it doesn't. It's, you make the case, as Rachel said, for the significance of your property, whatever that means in your community and in your context.
Yeah.
Okay, 3 minutes left. So maybe this is a good one to end on. And maybe it's a little hard to answer, but which components of the application are given the most weight in selecting the awardee?
I don't think there is any one question or criteria area that is given more weight than another. They're all really important. Each of the 6 core criteria are important. However, as far as the application goes, I think that I would identify that very first section called Case for Support as especially important because it's like the elevator speech. It's our first impression of your congregation. It's the elevator speech that kind of outlines, who you are, why you're coming to us, and why we should support you. So I would say there is no one piece that is more important, but make sure that you spend some time and energy on that initial case for support.
Okay, and then I think the last thing is folks are just wanting to know who to contact with additional questions.
Sure. All right. Well, in that case, Lily Hamilton and Fund for Sacred Places at savingplaces.org. That is it. So deadline, I think many of you know this, the application deadline is March 3rd at 11:59 p.m. Eastern. Thank you so much for coming today. We so appreciate your time and look forward to reading your applications and connecting with you in the coming weeks.